Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Real Theology. I'm Ben Watkins, and I'll be your host today. I'm joined today by a very special guest, Professor Pete Mandik. Professor Pete, how are you? Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm doing all right. I'm recaffeinated. I had to re-up my caffeine dose since it's nighttime, and but I'm ready to rock and roll and talk about the mind.
So, Pete is a professor of philosophy, psychology, and cognitive science at William Patterson University in New Jersey. Pete, can you tell us just a little bit about your work? What got you interested in philosophy, and why philosophy of mind?
Yeah, let's see. I got hooked on philosophy in high school. Um, I had a lot of these like science interests starting in, like primary school and like in the early 80s, Carl Sagan's Cosmos was on TV. I was really into that. So I was very nerdy and into Star Wars and Star Trek and all that from an early age. By the time I got into high school, I was hanging out in the psychology section of the high school library trying to solve my emotional problems by reading the donated books. And so in the 80s, the books on the shelf were from the 60s. And there's a lot of mention of existentialism in these books about psychoanalysis. And that caught my eye. Like existentialism sounds pretty badass, and it's a big word. I'm attracted to big words as a nerd. So like my sophomore year in high school, I'm reading Sartre and Nietzsche, and I did like an honors thesis. We had an honors program in high school, and I did this combined essay and painting project on the big existentialist authors, Heidegger, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Sartre. And of course, like I'm in high school, I don't understand fucking Heidegger. I can swear on this, right? Um,
You sure can.
yeah, fucking Heidegger. I didn't understand it then, and but I made a painting about it and wrote a little essay. And I I had this high school English teacher who kind of became my mentor throughout my high school career. She was just this really amazing woman, Ms. Myers. Hope you're still alive, Pat Myers. Really influenced me. She managed to talk me into talking my dad into driving me out from the Chicago suburbs to Indiana University to attend a week-long philosophy summer camp, in which we like just for fun. There was no AP credit or anything like that. Just for fun, we had basically a whole semester of college level philosophy 101 crammed into a single week. And we had typewriters in these dorm rooms, and we had 3 essay assignments every day. And it sounds like a completely insane way for a high school kid to spend a big chunk of their summer, but I loved it. And one of the things I loved about it is this is the first time I was on a college campus. My dad's a high school dropout. We don't really have college as part of my family culture. And um, this is kind of pre-internet too. So the only way to get information is like hanging out in libraries and bookstores. And so this is the first time I set foot in a college bookstore. And 2 books leapt out at me. Douglas Hofstadter's Good Lesher Bach, and the book The Mind's Eye that Hofstadter co-edited with Daniel Dennett. And it was that second one in particular that really grabbed me because it was this anthology that had like science fiction stories in it, literary fiction. You've got, fiction by Borges, Lamb, but also like Nagel's What's It Like to Be a Bat is in there. There's some Dennett things in there. I'm pretty sure Dennett's Where Am I is in there. And that sunk its hooks in me. Um, and I didn't really know what to do with that until like after I graduated from high school and decided not to go to college, um, and was working in a truck repair in the family business. But then when I went back to college, I thought like, well, I kind of like this artificial intelligence stuff. And originally, when I was going to college, uh, after a 3-year gap, I thought I was going to be a computer science engineer, like so I could build artificial intelligence, and I'm glad I did that. I did a bunch of calculus and computer programming, and I'm glad to have that under my belt. But then after a year of that, I switched over to psychology and rapidly decided, with apologies to all my psychologist colleagues, that they were stupid. I had bad luck. The one particular professor that was teaching the one psychology class that I took, I thought this guy was a dope. But I was taking this like GE credit ethics class, and the philosophy professor, this guy was so cool. Like he would just, um, he had this big turquoise scarab ring that he always wore, and he'd talk about the ring of Gyges thought experiment, and then he'd like turn his ring inside and out. And he had this big, bushy, like Mark Twain or Gene Shalit mustache, and he'd stroke his mustache while he was thinking. He had crazy, wild hair, and yeah, we would have these amazing conversations in class. It was just like this big bullshit session, and I recognized that like this is in my DNA. Like being a philosophy person, this is me. Even though I have like these leanings towards science and stuff, I thought like, yeah, I'm happy here. I'm obviously like really good at this, and this guy, this professor, like he's not a rich man, but he's not poor. Like I know he has a home and an automobile, and what the fuck else do you need? I don't need a yacht or anything like that. I just want a roof over my head and a job that I love. And so I threw myself into it. I decided like I'm going to be a philosophy professor, and I don't care if they ship me to Oklahoma or someplace like even worse. Um, I just want to do that, and then one thing led to another. Next thing you know, I'm at University of Illinois, and I was very fortunate to have another excellent woman be kind of a mentor to me. So now I'm moving on from Ms. Myers in high school to the philosopher Kathleen Akins. She was at the University of Illinois at the time. For the past several decades, she's been at Simon Fraser University uh, in Canada. Kathleen Akins is really closely associated with the neurophilosophy movement. She was an undergraduate student of the Churchlands when they were
Oh
in
wow.
Canada, and before they went to UC San Diego. After she finished grad school, she went and was one of these postdocs working with Dan Dennett at Tufts University. So she was my undergraduate professor for philosophy of mind, and I knew I wanted to do philosophy of mind, and I had these kind of scientific leanings, and I really liked Dennett and the Churchlands, and she had this close association with them, and so I decided right then and there, like, this is me. I'm going to be a philosopher of mind, and I'm going to be a neurophilosopher. Like, I love brains, um, and Kathleen and I stayed close for years and years and years. After undergrad, I went to graduate school at the PNP program at Washington University in St. Louis, the Philosophy, Neuroscience, Psychology program. And while I was there, that's when Andy Clark, Jesse Prinz, Bill Bechtel were there. Fellow students were people like Chris Elias Smith, Tad Zavitsky. Like it was just a awesome, magical time. I was coming in just as David Chalmers was coming out. He was one of the postdocs at PNP, and I got to meet Chalmers like before he, had his first like tenure track philosophy job
Back when he
in the
was still
conscious
just a
mind.
really groovy hippie.
He was just a groovy guy who was, irritating all the physicalists with his consciousness bullshit, and but like just really magnetic and super. And he's still like this very generous person. Chalmers, I disagree with him about everything, but I like his general style, and he's just a cool guy. And everyone who meets him will say like, it's amazing how generous this guy is. Like he just has time for everybody, and but yeah, that was a really great, wonderful time. And then to bring Kathleen Akins back into it as I was graduating the PNP program in the year 2000, Kathleen Akins had just gotten this $1 million grant from the McDonald Foundation. There was this set of they call them Millennium Grants for research in complex systems. So there was like some grants that went out to people doing work in oncology and people doing work in like cosmology, physics stuff, and there was two that went out for stuff that was kind of neuro related, and she got one of these $1 million grants, and she used that to start the McDonald Foundation for the Philosophy of Neurosciences, and I applied to that and got in. I got in as one of the junior researchers. So my first few years, right out of grad school, and now I'm a tenure track professor, at William Patterson University was my first job. Got it right out of grad school. I'm also affiliated with this project in in philosophy and neuroscience, and other people in that project included like Thomas Metzinger and Alvin Noe and
Oh
Rick
wow,
Rush and
kind of living a philosophy dream there.
oh, it was amazing. And they're they've got all this money, and they're doing it to have these like amazing conferences in these like vacation locations. So like we would have these meetings in the woods in the Pacific Northwest outside of Vancouver, and then we had some meetings down in Australia, and we had this island to ourselves here on island right off the Great Barrier Reef, and like we're giving talks to each other while drinking beers and eating oysters, and then taking breaks to go snorkeling and scuba diving, and I'm just thinking like
Great.
this is all because I like read some Dan Dennett and Douglas Hofstadter, and then boom, here I am. And it's in a lot of ways been, it feels like a charmed life that I just um, it's my job to think about like these really trippy, far out things, like dude, what if you took a bunch of atoms and rearranged them? They could be a mind. Like, what if you uploaded yourself into a computer, and how do you know you're not already living in the matrix? That I mean, that kind of stuff is just that's like the science fiction stuff that I was into as a little kid, and now I'm being paid to write about it and teach it, and I try to always push it, like, well, what else can I do with this? Like, I have tenure now, like, what can I do to make it interesting and exciting, and take advantage of that like security that I have. And so I've branched out into things like, I'm a published cartoonist. Um, I've been publishing this philosophy comic on a monthly basis at the website Daily News, which is a big group blog for philosophy professionals. And I've been doing this comic strip for them almost 10 years now. And that's
It's
translated
really
into
been
some,
10 years.
yeah, it started in 2015, so it's sneaking up on 10 years of that Mind Chunks comic, and I now have several graphic novels under contract with
Oh,
Hackett,
wow.
um, and yeah, so um, uh, like there are these the project is called Philosophy Comics, and right now I have three of these graphic novels under contract, and if they sell, then the whole project will go under contract. It'll be a 10-book thing, um,
Oh, that's awesome.
kind of
Well,
like introducing the topic. So the first one's going to be about philosophy of mind, and then the next one's going to be about ethics, and there's going to be one about critical thinking, and if it takes off, there's going to be one about the classic arguments for and against the
sure.
existence of God, and one about free will, and one about
All the
knowledge of the
perennial
external world.
staples of philosophy.
Yes. So and I recently just sold my first science fiction story. um I've got a love of fiction and have dabbled in writing fiction, but until recently hadn't taken seriously that, well, I could publish that. Like, I already have, I've published these academic articles and books, and why not?
Yeah,
So this summer
the itch of a writer. I relate.
yes, I mean, and it's so rich. There's all these rich connections between speculative fiction, science fiction, but also like weird fiction and horror, and on the one hand, and then philosophy on the other. And so I took a bit of kind of a risk this summer. I was invited to submit an article to this special issue of the Journal of Consciousness Studies, dedicated to the topic of introspection. And the editors for that were the illusionist philosophers Keith Frankish and Francois Camerer. And I've been friends with Keith Frankish for a pretty long time, even though I don't think we've ever met in person. We're like, we're brain buddies.
Sure.
We interact through cyberspace and stuff. And so I was invited to submit something, and they figured like, Mandik, he'll write about robots and or maybe something like that. And I was really kind of stuck. I was kind of had this major writer's block and having a hard time getting going on the project. And then I had this flash of insight, one of these like standing in the shower sort of moments, like literally taking a shower, and then suddenly it comes to me like, why don't I write something that's kind of a science fiction story, but also would fit in with this academic theme and work simultaneously as a science fiction story and an academic article. So I wrote this thing and published it in this thing that called Sliders, and it's about this kind of science fiction idea that has shown up in a few published science fiction stories, not by me, um, where someone has some kind of brain implant that allows them to modify parts of their mind, and the interface is when you activate this brain implant, you'll see in your visual field a slider, and the slider will allow you to modify something like, for example, your mood or other mental states that vary along a linear scale, like courage,
Yeah.
confidence, anxiety, excitement, pleasure. So you might be getting ready for a job interview and feeling kind of anxious, and you want to calm yourself down. So
Got it.
you bring up the slider, and it says, calm, not calm, and you slide it, and then you're like, oh, that's a little too calm. I want to have some pep. So you slide it back up. And some of the science fiction stories that are about this sort of technology, a lot of them have a kind of a dark edge to them, because um, one closely related science fiction technology is something called wireheading. So science fiction stories where people get implants that directly connect to their pleasure centers, and if you have a button that can give you ultimate pleasure, I mean, that's more addictive than the most addictive drug. Where you're cutting out the middleman of putting some powder up your nose, just go right to the source. And as soon as you start pushing that button, what motive do you have to not push the button? What could possibly be more rewarding than just pushing the button again?
It seems to echo the pleasure machine, Nozick's.
Yes. Yeah. It's related to that too. Do we need some kind of so-called real reality in order to have a life worth living is one of the things that gets connected to this. But the thing that I wrote, I ended up writing this epistolary story. So it was written in the second person. I'm addressing the reader directly. Hello, I'm from the future and I'm talking to you, and I have some bad news for you, and I hope you can tell the rest of the human race about this terrible technology that is going to destroy your future unless you do something about it. And so through the course of it, I tell kind of like this, spoiler alert, this like really awful kind of horror story, this dystopian sci-fi horror story about like all the just really terrible and unethical things they do to market and test this technology in the first place, and then the horrible side effects that it has as it's sprung on society. But along the way, it's also this academic article where I'm like citing all the different science fiction stories. So it works as kind of a piece of like just like sci-fi analysis, um, and also delving into the philosophical issues of like, well, what is introspection? What does it mean to have direct knowledge of one's mental state, as opposed to like the kind of mediated knowledge of your mental state that you might have by way of like, you go to a doctor and for some reason they want to do a functional MRI, and they tell you that you're really anxious because there's all this activity in this one particular region in your brain. And okay, like assuming you trust them, now you maybe have some knowledge, but that's very different from just feeling that you're anxious. Or is it? Is that knowledge that we think is direct via introspection really indirect after all? And so another issue that I'm grappling with in this story is, what might introspection be for? Like, what is it? What might it be doing for us? Like, why would it be helpful to have this knowledge of our mental states? What could you do with that? And one of the things that you might do with that is try to change them. And so the sliders is kind of this thought experiment about, like, well, what if you not only had very direct knowledge of what's going on with yourself mentally, but what if you also had a very direct sort of control of what's going on with yourself mentally? And one of the scenarios that I discuss in this little article is something I call the bloody stumps phenomenon. So, as it's spelled out in the article or the story, one of the prisoners that they're doing these, like, kind of really creepy experiments on, um, they they give him an iteration of the technology that allows him to bump up his willpower. Gets a willpower slider, and the way this ends up working out is that whatever you contemplate maybe doing, like, you get a little whim, like, oh, I think I would like to walk across the United States. If you happen to have just recently bumped up your willpower slider to, let's say, 100%, then nothing will stop you from setting out on that journey. And also, nothing will stop you from continuing on that journey. So along the way, this guy, like, sprains his ankle, but he doesn't let that stop him because he's got 100% willpower.
Yeah.
And then later on, he
Using his
breaks.
freedom to control his freedom. I love it.
Yeah, he used his freedom to in some sense take away his freedom, and he dies. This is why it's called the bloody stumps. He wears the ends of his limbs down, like he just grinds his own feet and hands off as he's crawling across the asphalt to
Because he has
continue his
100%
journey.
willpower.
He has 100% willpower, and eventually he only stops when he bleeds out and dies. And
Oh, man.
and the scientists let him do it because, like, they just want to see how far it will go. And
Yeah. It's an experiment
it's an
with no
experiment.
ethical regulations whatsoever.
No, but a lot of shareholders got a lot of value out of that. So that was my first foray. I kind of, like, snuck into publishing fiction. I, like, hijacked the
That's
academic
awesome.
process, and I didn't ask the editors ahead of time if that was cool. Like, I just sprung it on them, and I'm like, oh shit, I hope they're not going to be mad. And,
Surprise!
and they said they loved it, and I got some positive feedback from other people about it too. And so then I'm like, oh well, I should do more of that. I should do, like, the real thing, like submit to actual fiction venues. And so I've got I just kind of happened upon this call for submissions for this new online science fiction and fantasy magazine called Crab Tales. The editor in chief of this is a philosopher in Ireland who also publishes fiction, and I met her through Blue Sky. One of the main cool things that happened to me trying to switch over from Twitter to Blue Sky is I met this philosopher who also writes fiction. It just as I was learning about her work, I learned that she was starting this um, magazine that's just about crabs, and she was calling for submissions about any stories about crabs that would be either science fiction or fantasy. And I thought, that just sounds so weird. Like, I want to be able to say, like, I I'm coming out in Crab magazine. So I, like, brainstormed and I came up with a story about crabs, and
Nice.
sold. Like, I'm gonna be, I'm making 3 cents a word for my crab story. So I'm like,
That's awesome.
coming out crabby.
One of the reasons I invited you on today was because of your writing. So I've been reading some of your work, and you have what's called type Q physicalism, materialism, however
Yes.
you want to use. And
Type Q
so
materialism.
type Q materialism, Q
Yes.
being kind of like a Quinian.
Q for Quine.
Yeah, Q for Quine. And so, to help people who might be listening that aren't familiar with these labels, in the philosophy of mind, there's a specific division that's usually called a type A physicalist, a type B physicalist, or a type C physicalist.
Yeah.
What is that category? Oh, excuse
Yeah.
me. Hang on. We'll
It's a
cut
hard
that
word to
part
pronounce. I don't know if I
out.
would do it well either. Categorization.
Yeah. What is that categorization,
Yes.
and why do you see your view as opposed to that way of structuring the problem?
Yes. So all of this goes back to a paper David Chalmers published in 2003 called Consciousness and Its Place in Nature. Chalmers hits the scene, and for a lot of people, it's his 1996 book, The Conscious Mind, which is based on his PhD thesis from when he was at Indiana University. Second time now I mentioned Indiana University. So synchronicities are following us. But anyway, so in a lot of ways, consciousness and its place in nature, this 2003 article from Chalmers, is really where Chalmers kind of brings it all together, more so, I think, than in his 96 book. And one of the many brilliant things about this article of his is the way he talks about all the main arguments against physicalism is all having kind of a similar form and similar theme. And he um, says that these classic arguments, like, for example, Joe Levine's explanatory gap argument and Frank Jackson's Mary argument about knowing what it's like to see red, and the zombie conceivability argument, all of these are what Dave, we all call him Dave Chalmers. He calls epistemic gap arguments. That in each of these arguments, you could reconstruct them in such a way that you could see that what they're doing is trying to infer from the alleged existence of some epistemic gap, the existence of a metaphysical gap. So one example of an epistemic gap would be the Mary situation. So Mary is this super scientist who knows, hypothetically, all of the physical facts that are relevant to understanding human color vision, our consciousness of red and green, and she knows all the physical stuff. Um, but yet there's this gap in her knowledge. Allegedly, she wouldn't know what it's like to see red. But so what? So the argument alleges there must be this metaphysical gap.
Yeah.
Um,
She's
given
getting
this,
metaphysical information and not physical
yeah.
information.
So yeah, that there must then be this gap between the physical and the mental. So the phenomenal property of what it's like to see red or red quale must be some non-physical property. And you can see the explanatory gap argument is positing a slightly different epistemic gap. It's a gap not so much about knowledge, but more about explanation. The zombie argument, the epistemic gap is about what you can conceive. Um, you can you can con- you can conceive of zombies, um, and
It,
you could know, or you could conceive of there being a system that conforms to some physical theory of what's happening, but nonetheless you could conceive of that system lacking qualia. The zombie, so the epistemic gap is this
it could be
difference in what you can
psychologically
conceive.
identical, but have different phenomenal experiences, to use the jargon
Something
again.
like that, right? So this system would be able to walk and talk and pass IQ tests in all the way that you can. Um, we ask it what's its name, and it's going to say, "I'm Ben." Um, we show it paint chips, and it says what you would say, like, that's the red one and that's the blue one.
If we
But
pinch it, they say, ow.
they say, "Oh," but can't we conceive that even though it is able to do all those things in virtue of its physical arrangement on
Functioning.
the inside, that it nonetheless lacks qualia? And the inverted spectrum thought experiment is another one of these. Like, there's this epistemic gap. We could conceive of it having opposite qualia of what you have, even though it's physically just like you. So doesn't that lead to there being a metaphysical gap? So anyway, these gap arguments are kind of in the background and kind of helping illustrate like what the dialectic is about. We're arguing about phenomenal consciousness, aka what it's like, um, the qualitative character or phenomenal feel of, for example, seeing red or tasting an orange. Um, and there are two main responses, according to Chalmers, from materialists against these gap arguments. One sort of response is to say there's no epistemic gap. And so to try to block the arguments that way, you can't reason from an epistemic gap to a metaphysical gap if there was no epistemic gap in the first place. And this is what Chalmers labels type A materialism. And then type B materialism says, oh, yes, there is an epistemic gap, but here's how you can have that without there being the metaphysical gap. And that's what Chalmers labels type B materialism. And he goes on to label other kinds of materialisms that I don't think are super important. And he also introduces the other kinds of like non-materialism. So there's like type D dualism and type R Russellian monism, and he's got this whole alphabet soup. And one cynical interpretation is that he's overloading the reader with a bunch of information, and the reader kind of feels a little bit overwhelmed and maybe is more inclined to say like, oh, okay, you must be smart. You're probably onto something there. Um, and and another cynical thing one might say is that, like, maybe he's setting up the game in a certain way that is going to force his side to come out looking better. And we'll come back to that. But anyway, in this article, in a footnote, he mentions something that he calls type Q materialism. And I'm not going to remember it perfectly, but it says something along the lines of one might, following Quine, reject the main distinctions that are used in setting up the the problem space in the first place and the distinction between type A materialism and type B materialism. And we could call that type Q materialism for Quine. Again, this is all just happening in a footnote. It doesn't even get its own paragraph in this paper that's filled with all these different lettered materialisms. It's hidden in a footnote. Why not type Q materialism? Um, so when I was in graduate school, the chair of the department and the guy that like got the funding to start the PNP program, the philosophy, neuroscience, psychology program in the first place, was this philosopher Roger Gibson, who was a Quine scholar, and he wrote several books about Quine, and I think was the only Quine scholar who got Quine's endorsement. Like Quine, there's blurbs on his book from Quine saying like, "Yeah, Gibson gets me," or something like that. And when Roger, one of the grad students from that program was publishing a fetch shrift for Roger, and said, "Hey, Mandik, do you want to write something for this?" And I'd taken classes from Gibson and stuff, and I'm like, "Well, I'm a philosophy of mind guy, and most of this Quine stuff is like philosophy of language and epistemology, but like." Oh, I'm gonna write about type Q materialism. I'm gonna make that work, like, because I want to be in this fetch shrift for Roger Gibson. I want to say something about Quine, but also I want to, give my good friend David Chalmers some grief because I don't like, I like him, but I don't like, that all that zombie anti-materialism stuff. So I asked my friend from the CUNY Grad Center, Josh Weisberg, who's now down at University of Houston, a professor there. I'm like, you're a Quine guy too. You want in on this? And so it started like this title, like let's write a paper with this title and put it in this book about Quine. And um, we had a blast with it. And it was one of these things that it just kind of comes together and it writes itself. And some of the things I write, they just like get forgotten even by me. I'm just like, I'm glad that's over with. And other things kind of like stick. They kind of capture my imagination and other people's too. And so that's the story of Type Q Materialism, the paper. But the Type Q Materialism, the idea um, is that, yeah, like, well, what is what is suspicious about this epistemic gap stuff and the way Chalmers divides the terrain so maybe I should pause there and see how we're doing
Yeah.
before I get deeper into type Q materialism. But that's like kind of the background about type A and type B and real quick, type C is like Mysterianism, like Colin
Colin
McGinn.
McKinn.
Yeah, and you could read Tom Nagel's
No, yeah,
that
that's how I
paper.
read both of them as Mysterians.
Yeah, because Nagel, even though he's kind of giving a knowledge argument, he's kind of floating what really seems like an argument against materialism. He reels it in and says, like, well, I think I'm probably a materialist. I'm not convinced that non-materialism is the way to go here, but like we don't know. And so it's easy to kind of see that as being of a piece with McGinn Mysterianism instead of what you could also read it as being very aligned with Jackson's knowledge argument. But anyway, type C materialism is just say like, we don't know. Maybe there's a way we're going to understand it in the first place. And in some sense, that's not a very interesting view. What's more interesting are these two proposals, the type A materialism that says like there's no epistemic gap. And well, that's interesting. How could there like not be an epistemic gap? And um, well, one is if there's some kind of like set of analytic truths about consciousness, like that we can a priori know that consciousness is physical. So if you just think really hard about what consciousness is, you'll realize that anything that's functionally identical to a conscious creature will itself be a conscious creature. And so it's just a priori knowable that there couldn't possibly be a zombie. And another way of putting that is that it's a priori knowable that materialism is true. So that's a way of describing what type A materialism is supposed to be. And interestingly, Chalmers will offer as examples of type A materialists people like David Rosenthal, Daniel Dennett, Paul Churchland. And one thing that's interesting about that is that those guys don't believe in analytic truths.
Yeah,
Um,
it would be more
so
it would be more accurate to say someone like Jaegwon Kim or Frank
maybe,
Jackson are type A,
yeah,
because
maybe,
that idea of explanatory consent, explanatory assent, like we have to give definitions of you know the target property to be reduced. we
yes,
have we have to give definitions, not identities. They have to be literal definitions, and so I see those definitions being a
right.
priori, right?
If there's such thing as definitions, then yeah, there would be a priori.
Yeah, yeah, but
But that's a
assuming
bit of
there's
a
definitions,
yeah.
yeah.
So that's a bit of a preview of type Q materialism. But anyway, to just summarize what type A materialism is allegedly supposed to be, it's that there's no epistemic gap. So zombies aren't conceivable. Mary would know what it's like. Uh,
Yeah,
there
there's
would
no
be a full
Paulian
explanation.
inversion, and we could know what it's like to be a bat.
Yeah, all that stuff. And the reason why is because we a priori or like have analytic access to what consciousness is, and it is basically what functionalism would say it is. That there's this definition that we
Yeah,
can figure out if we just think hard enough about it. That like
we can say
what by
pain is the mental state that fulfills some causal role, and then we go
yeah,
find what the realizers of
yeah,
that.
what it is to see, to experience something as if being read is to be in the sort of mental state that would under certain conditions be caused in the presence of red things under certain lighting conditions, and further dispose you to sort paint chips in a certain sort of way and say things like that's red, and that paint chip is redder than that one. And so that whole set of relationships gives you a functional definition of what red is, and we could access that in a kind of a priori way. Probably one of the biggest examples, like clearest examples of someone who seems to perhaps believe this is David Lewis. And so David Lewis articulates a version of functionalism that ends up getting called Ramsey sentence functionalism after the philosopher Frank Ramsey. Ramsey is dealing with this problem in like the philosophy of science about like all these really complicated theoretical definitions of terms that kind of seem circular. Um, and he comes up with this logical technique of showing how they're not circular after all. And you get these really long, existentially quantified sentences, and you set up this elaborate, regimented, formalized articulation of the theory that you could demonstrate formally that it's not circular after all. There might be some loops and all that, but
Sure.
ultimately you can give like you could give a unique set of theoretical connections for each term, and so each term ends up being definable in a way that's ultimately not just circular. The way, if you define A as not B and B as not A, like, well, you really can't even tell which one is which. Like, you just know there's two of them. So so Lewis floats this idea that sometimes gets called analytic functionalism. That, as Lewis would describe it, we like collect these platitudes, like we consult our intuitions or ask people, like, well, what would you say, if Mary like was looking in the refrigerator for beer? Would that be believing? Would that be behavior that would go along with believing that there's beer and desiring to get some beer? And if someone was in pain, then yes or no, they would be more likely to say ouch or less likely to say ouch. And so you collect all these platitudes from people. You ask them, like, well, what would you say? How would you use these words? And this is, in some sense, it's an a priori exercise, because we're not like looking out in the world the way you would like point a telescope at Mars and see if it's got mountains on it. We're just like thinking about the meanings of our words by asking
Mhm.
ourselves, what will we say? And Lewis kind of asserts or hypothesizes that we would actually come up with a body of agreed upon platitudes. And then from there, you could just plug them into the Ramsey apparatus, formalize that whole set of platitudes, and come up with this like definition of whatever you want: consciousness, belief, being in pain, seeing red. And so that would be the functionalist theory of what it is to have a conscious state. And then Lewis
So,
introduces complications that we maybe not need not get into, but maybe cast a
sure.
little bit of doubt of how much did he really believe in this sketched out analytic functionalism. But it seems safe to say that at least some people kind of um, seem to be flirting with the analytic functionalism. So there's like some people that hold the higher order thought theory of consciousness. Some of what they say kind of looks like they think that they're articulating analytic truths about conscious states, but it's hard to pin them down. Like, because some of them, if you ask them directly, like, do you take this to be analytic, they'll say no, nothing's analytic, we believe Quine. So are they type A materialists after all? It's, philosophy is not as easy as textbooks would lead you to believe, where
Sure.
people are either in this camp or that camp. It's just a bunch of people saying a bunch of stuff, and it's really hard to get any kind of generalizations to stick to anybody. Plus, people change their mind too, so that makes it complicated as well. But anyway, let's talk about type B materialism a little bit. So, type B materialism says yes, there's an epistemic gap. Yeah, it is true that Mary wouldn't know. Uh, and it is true that there's an explanatory gap. You could still, no matter how good the scientific theory of consciousness is, you could always ask, like, why is that like seeing
Why
red?
does pain feel like pain and not like
Yeah.
tickle or itch?
And so, well, then how could there be an epistemic gap without there being some corresponding metaphysical gap of actual non-physical properties? And the main sort of story that you get from people that end up being labeled as type B materialists is this thing that gets called the phenomenal concepts strategy. So some philosophers hypothesize that while there's no dualism in reality between the physical and the phenomenal, between matter and consciousness, there is a dualism in our concepts. So, in some sense, to put it really simply, conscious states just are brain states. So in reality, it's just one thing, but we have these two different concepts for them. One of the concepts is this phenomenal concept. It's a concept that is isolated from the rest of
First
our
person
concepts.
concept.
Yeah, we apply it in the first person case. It's informationally isolated, meaning a lot of your concepts, there's all sorts of inferences that you could draw from them. So for example, if you conceive of this animal as being a dog, um, you're probably going to infer from it that it's a mammal, or that it's got feet, or that it's got fur. There's all sorts of things, all sorts of concepts that go along with the concept of being a dog, and licenses certain inferences from the one concept to the other concept. If I thought of you as being alive, I would infer that you breathe. Um, and it would be really weird if I thought that you were that you had been successfully assassinated, but yet are still conducting this interview with me, right? That would be like some real weird disconnect between your
Yeah.
concepts. And the hypothesis about phenomenal concepts is that we have these special concepts that really aren't connected to the rest of our concepts. That you've got this concept of what it's like to experience red, that just when you experience red, boom, there's the concept. Um, and you cannot reason to that concept. You couldn't like study the brain and then come up with that concept, even though what that concept refers to and what your theoretical concept of neural activity in area V4 of cerebral cortex, those two different concepts both refer to one and the same thing, which is namely this neural activation, which is one and the same as the experience of seeing red. You have these two different concepts, and they're very different concepts. You can't reason from the one to the other. And there's slightly different models of this. One of them is that the phenomenal concept of what it's like to see red works the way like quotation works. So like in written language, the way direct quotation works is you take some words and you put them in double quote marks, and now those words refer to those words. There's other ways I could refer to those words. I could refer to them as like what what appeared in the second sentence of the previous paragraph. That's a description that refers to those words. Or I could quote it. And non-linguistic examples of this sort of representation might be the sorts of things that we would call like exemplification. So like if I went to a carpet store with a carpet sample and I said I would like I would like 800 square feet of this. Um, I'm using this sample of a carpet to refer to a type of carpet. Which type of carpet? The type of carpet that it is exemplifying. It's instantiating the very property that I'm trying to refer to. And paint chips work this way. I might show someone a cupcake and say I want a whole birthday cake made out of this. And so the idea one version of the phenomenal concept strategy is that we've got these special concepts that refer to the phenomenal experience of seeing red, not by describing it, not by saying like, well, it's the experience you would have that's kind of more like orange than green is. You refer to it by like literally quoting it, like the qualia just goes into the belief somehow. Like what? Like what are you talking about? Because they're materialists, right? So like this is literally happening in the brain.
This is
What
a function of the brain, or
what
identical to
yeah, how
some.
does that how do brain states quote other brain states? Like it's very it's got this it's got kind of um this like little ad hoc kind of feeling to it. Like it's a little bit hard to take seriously as an empirical proposal. There's this phenomenon and they're describing a, like a way that the phenomenon would work that would be consistent with their stating that there's no epistemic gap, and that doesn't mean it's false. So it's a little bit fishy. And also just one of the weird things about it, aside from like it's a little bit hard to believe that there are these inferentially isolated concepts, and also it's hard to believe those are actually concepts. That doesn't seem like what a concept is. It plausibly what a concept is the sort of thing that isn't like that. And Another thing that's bothered a lot of people is that you get these brute identities. Like you just have this, yeah, this is
Yeah.
identical to that.
Pain is just C fires firing.
That's it. And there's nothing else to say. With other identities, I mean, this gets really tricky and really can break your brain rapidly because there's certain identities like we like, okay, so Samuel Clemens is Mark Twain. Why is Samuel Clemens Mark Twain? Well, like, wait, what are you asking?
Yeah, there's a causal story to be told about
you,
Samuel Clemens.
You wouldn't like if I said Pete Mandik is identical to Pete Mandik or my coffee mug is identical to my coffee mug. Well, there's no question why there. So there's something about these different descriptions that it seems like we could meaningfully ask.
There's an individual with the property of, the author of Mark Twain, and there's an individual with the property of being born Samuel Clemens. And these two ways of describing refer to the same individual. I guess.
Watch yourself, because we're talking about properties.
Yeah.
Right. We're not talking about an individual having two different properties. That might lead us into property dualism. So we're interested in the property of what it's like to see red. And there's this proposal that what it's like to see red, that property is identical to the property of having such and such neural activity in area V4. So these two different descriptions or two different concepts, how are they different? How are the concepts different? What makes them different? If you say, and some philosophers have said this, like the only way they could be different is if there's different properties that they attribute. That's what makes them different. Then boom, you're back into property dualism. And that's what the materialist is trying to avoid. They're trying to be a property monist. There's only the physical properties somehow. So how do these separate concepts work? Anyway, hopefully you at least get a feel for what might be a little bit problematic or mysterious about that.
So with those two categories on the table, so we'll just kind of put type C to the side for a second. We've got this type A and type B materialism. And for listeners who might not be familiar with Quine, so one of his famous papers is called The Two Dogmas of Empiricism. And famously in that paper, he undermines one of the dogmas of empiricism that he sees as what's called the analytic synthetic divide. And so it's this idea that we have this set of truths that are just true by definition. And then this other set of truths that are known a priori, but are not definitions. They're substantive, non-trivial claims. And so he kind of dispels this distinction. He says that this distinction is a dogma and that we're better off without this distinction. Do you see your strategy with type Q materialism as being analogous to that same strategy? You're dissolving the type A, type B distinction in a similar way
Yes.
that Quine is trying to dissolve this analytic synthetic distinction.
Yeah, some of the similarities are very directly involving agreeing with Quine about the analytic synthetic distinction. And some of it is inspired by other parts of Quine's writings, like, for example, his suspicion about um, modalities like possibility and necessity, and some of it is just suspicions that he has about uh, these these alleged like first person kinds of knowledge, these special kinds of knowledge. But just to say something specifically about the analytic synthetic distinction, it's a it's a giant paper. There's no way I'm going to do justice to two dogmas of empiricism in just a few minutes. Um, but really briefly, the the view that he's attacking is that there are these analytic truths that aren't simply stipulated truths, because he doesn't want to argue against that. There are, I could stipulate that, for the rest of this conversation, we could agree uh, that when I say ham sandwich, I'm referring to Ben Watkins. Um, and so if I said Ben Watkins is a ham sandwich, that's not only true, like we just know it's true without investigating. Like as long as we paid attention to the stipulation, there's no further question there. So he's not arguing against those kind of analytic truths, the stipulated truths. Um, and less silly examples would be like in theoretical discourse, like in mathematics or something like that. You introduce a term and you say like, from here on out,
Yeah, X
what I
equals this.
yeah, like what I mean by ordered pair is just this. And so whatever intuitions you have about ordered pairs, we don't care about. We're just stipulating that for this paper, what we mean by ordered pair is this. And so then there's going to be these like trivial analytic truths about the stipulated meaning. Quine's not arguing against those, nor is he arguing against logical truths. So there are certain things that are true just as a matter of the formal system of, for example, first order
Mhm,
logic. So, given the way in formal sentential first order bivalent logic,
mhm,
given the definition of negation, if you've got a proposition uh, and you put a negation operator in front of it, then whatever truth value the proposition has, the negated proposition will have the other truth value. And then you can stack the negation operators. So if you've got two negation operators, they cancel each other out. Um, and so not P entails P. And you might say, well, that kind of makes sense. Like in English, sometimes we do that, but also in English, sometimes we don't. We're not talking about English. We're talking about this logical system, and there's certain logical truths in that system. So if P and Q, then P, right? It follows as a logical truth, and Quine's not arguing against those either. And he's saying like, if we exclude stipulated analytic truths, and if we exclude logical, like any truths that seem analytic but they just reduce to logical truths, um, then there's nothing left. And so someone might say, well, what about um, bachelors or unmarried males? Isn't it isn't it true by definition? Doesn't bachelor just mean unmarried male? Um, well, if we had all stipulated that that's what it meant, then it would be a stipulated truth. Um, if unmarried male and bachelor just mean the same thing by stipulation, then yeah, of course that's true and analytically so. But we're not talking about that. Um, and also we could raise the question like, well, is it stipulated true? Like, did anyone sit down and like, did the council of English speakers all agree that for here on out that's what it means. Like, no, that's not how our language works. People use language in certain ways, and dictionary writers observe people using language, and they try to like come up with some condensed description of how people use language, but they're not like discovering the definition. um, Dictionary definitions aren't like
Yeah, the
what
final
you mean.
word,
Yeah,
so
they're
to
not the
speak.
final word. They're not like the rules that you have to follow. They're an empirical statement
Yeah.
that's kind of rough
And
and
if you
trying
see
to.
how dictionaries change over time, you observe how language has changed over time.
Yeah, and there's all sorts of like cases where we kind of don't know what to say. Like you can't just read the dictionary and then solve um, epistemology. You can't just read the dictionary and see like, oh, knowledge is justified true belief. It's in the dictionary. We don't need Gettier cases. Just read the dictionary. Like
Just
we, you know,
stipulate that
we
the
know that
knowledge.
it doesn't work that way. And so, so then you're like, so, and then you can come up with counter examples. Like, so, the Pope is an unmarried male, but is the Pope a bachelor? Well, I mean, look, the definition is just no, wait a minute. We don't know what the definition is. We're trying to figure out what the definition is. So this seems like an admissible question. Like, is the Pope an unmarried male? Yes or no? Is the Pope a bachelor? Yes or no? And some people would say, like, no, he's not a bachelor. And I guess that's a counterexample to this proposed truth. It turns out it's not true. And so I'm probably doing a terrible job of summarizing Quine's case against the analytic synthetic distinction. I haven't read it in a couple decades, but the gist of it is to be very suspicious of there being any analytic truths, to be very suspicious of there being any truths that are true by meaning. And part of it, some of this is inspired by other parts of Quine, and some of this is what I'm about to say is inspired by just other people in cognitive science and thinking about language and how humans understand language. It's just really implausible that what they are carrying around in their head is like a little list of necessary and sufficient conditions. We pick up words and we use words and we kind of like try to fit the pattern of the way other people use words, and sometimes we discover that we each are inclined to use the words in slightly different ways in certain circumstances. And then we talk about it like, yeah, what would you call that? Like is a necktie an article of clothing? Like, would you call a rug a piece of furniture? Like, you get in these arguments because like we actually had different things in mind, and we didn't notice that we were kind of talking about slightly different things. And there, like lots of people before Quine noticed this sort of thing. Like Wittgenstein famously, made fun of the idea that meanings were definitions, and famously proposed this like family resemblance view of concepts, like the concept of a game. And so this skepticism of analyticity is older than Quine, and you know another element of Quine that comes later in Quine's work that can kind of uh, raise some skeptical doubts about this too is his work about translation and the indeterminacy of translation. And he's got these famous thought experiments about like imagine you encounter this group of people that speak a language that you've never encountered before. No one alive on the planet Earth is bilingual in this language. How would you go about coming up with a unique and correct translation manual of that language into English? You don't have the benefit of any currently existing bilingual speakers of that speak English and this target language. Um, and Quine comes up with these thought experiments to show that you could, based on all the data that you have, like you could scan the brains of these speakers. You could observe them every moment of their life using all these different making all these different utterances in the presence of all these different objects, and you still wouldn't know for sure if, when they said Gavagai, while seeming to point at a rabbit, you wouldn't know if they meant rabbit or if they meant undetached rabbit part. Because suppose they did mean undetached rabbit part. Well, in pointing at a rabbit, you're pointing at one or more undetached rabbit parts, and there's all these different possible translations that seem to be clearly underdetermined by any possible evidence that you could collect.
If a
Like
lion could
even if,
speak, we couldn't understand him.
yeah, that kind of like that, kind of that sort of thing. Or you couldn't come up with a unique understanding of him. You could come up with a couple different hypotheses. And
And our forms of life would just be so different. Like we would just be assumed, like even if they pointed at something, like we take pointing as like an ostension, kind of like, hey, over there. Well, their
yeah,
pointing might mean something different, and you would just not know that. Their form of life,
right,
pointing could mean something
yeah.
like "I'm hungry,"
The problem runs
or
a little deeper than that because, like, you know, it's not like we're talking about a lion. We're talking about other human beings, and
yeah,
Quine explicitly says, like, this problem comes home. Like, even so-called other English speakers, you can't be sure that when they say rabbit, they mean what you mean by rabbit. For all
yeah.
you know,
For all you know, they could have something else in their beetle box.
yeah. And if you want to get really weird, and this kind of brings us home to some qualia and phenomenal consciousness stuff, you don't know that you mean the same thing. By
Yeah,
like, how would you know that you mean the same thing, right? And a lot of people, especially people that like cut their teeth on Descartes and are really used to, like, oh, I think therefore I am. I can't be wrong about the inside of my own mind. They cannot wrap their head around this proposal at all. But once you really put some
yeah,
effort into understanding it, like you realize, like, oh wow, you know, you thought the problem of skepticism about the external world was bad. Skepticism about the internal world is really messed up. Like, so how do you know what you mean by rabbit? Like, do you listen to yourself say rabbit? Do you form a mental picture of a rabbit? Well, pictures are open to multiple interpretations. And what would be the difference between a mental picture of a rabbit and a mental picture of undetached rabbit parts? Right? Like
yeah.
well, I feel like I know what I mean, but like, who fucking cares what you feel like? What is the meaning of that feeling, right? And so you rapidly get to this point where you got some philosophers that'll just slam the table and say, I know what I mean, and other philosophers saying, like, no, you don't. You don't know shit. Like, you could say that, but how do you know what you mean when you say that? And this part of what makes philosophy so fun is that sometimes we get to this point where we just sound like insane people yelling at each other about the most inane shit. Like, I know that's yellow. That thing behind Ben is yellow. Like, what's yellow? What do you mean?
Hey guys, it's Justin. Sorry to interrupt, but we put a lot of time and effort into these episodes because we think it's very important that people come to think more carefully about religious ideas. And you're watching the episode, so you probably agree to some extent, and yet many of you, no, most of you even, are not even subscribed to the channel. Please, don't make it weird, just subscribe. Better yet, please consider supporting us by becoming a patron for early access to our content and other benefits. For example, if you support us at the $5 level, that means that we have to make a response video to a video of your choosing. Speaking of support, we want to thank Bike Mearns, Charles Hoffer, Robin Willems, and Ed Atkinson. The music featured in this episode is by Chicago-based band Casserole, and it's used with permission. Anyway, that's all. Back to the episode.
So to bring it in, so our show explores questions in the philosophy of religion mainly. So to
Yes.
kind of bring philosophy of religion into this, so we've talked about some different forms of materialism. But so these forms of materialism are going to be contrasted with different forms of dualism. And so there's two really big schools of thought in dualism. There's the Cartesian substance dualists, and then there's the property dualists. And so it seems that the conversations between the physicalists and the dualists largely take up the space of property dualism versus physicalism. And substance dualism is kind of one of those waning views, at least in the current literature as it is now. If you ask substance dualists, they'll tell you that substance dualism is experiencing something of a renaissance and is coming back and is being respectable again. And with good reason if you're a theist, because it seems that theists are committed to some form of substance dualism if they think that God is this non-physical substance that caused a physical world to exist. You've got to have this kind of dualism of God's substance is mind, and then this distinct physical world from God, because God and the world aren't the same thing. They're different on most traditional models of God. And so that's why substance dualism can seem attractive. My view is that the closer we move towards physicalism, the further we move away from this substance dualist view, and that counts against explanations that appeal to something like a non-physical cause that created the external world. Do you see physicalism as being a similar threat to theism as a whole generally, or do you think physicalism can be squared with theism? Famously, Peter Van Inwagen is a physicalist and a theist, so he would certainly press back on what I've just said. How do you see that dialectical kind of playing out?
My views on this are very weird.
Awesome.
Very weird indeed. So changing let's go back to philosophy of mind a little bit. And then I'll get back to religion. So one sort of issue that we haven't really discussed yet today in philosophy of mind is the one surrounding so-called eliminative materialism. Type A materialists, as we've discussed them today in this discussion, we've described them as saying that, as we might put it, consciousness exists, but we can give a functionalist, physicalist definition of what consciousness is. But another way of being a type A materialist, which is ultimately someone who denies there's the epistemic gap, is someone who denies that there's consciousness. And more broadly, eliminative materialists come in lots of different flavors. Most famously, the Churchlands were about eliminative materialism, about the propositional attitudes, that there's really such a thing as believing that today is Wednesday, as opposed to just having a bunch of neural activity, which is way more complicated than anything that you could really map belief talk onto. And so they recommend that we regard belief talk as just this really old theory that
it's like witches.
We should just reject it. Like we don't say that demons exist and that we discovered that demons are viruses. We just reject that demons ever existed, and we say, like, anything that you want to in the past would want to attribute to demons, we could explain it. Some of it we could explain by getting an infection, and some of it we could explain by a chemical imbalance in the central nervous system, and some of it we could maybe explain by mass hysteria. But there isn't some single phenomenon that the demon talk picked out. If it picked out anything, it picked out some supernatural thing that we feel like we don't have any good reason to believe in. But we don't retain the word demon and say that it actually refers to this thing that we can also access scientifically, the way that we might retain the pre-scientific word heat. People have talked about things being hot and cold and temperature, and we say, like, well, actually that's identical to the scientific things like the average kinetic energy in a system of molecules, that's heat, or that's temperature, and
Yeah.
heat is something like the
But we
total
don't
amount of
find
energy in a system.
temperature in the fundamental equations of physics. Temperature is one of those higher level function of the motion of kinetic particles at a
Right.
higher
And
level.
and and we make these proposals, for how to map the pre-theoretic language into the theoretical language. And one interesting thing I think a lot of people don't take enough notice of is along the way we changed the old ways of using the words. So like pre-theoretically, people might not have distinguished between temperature and heat. Um, but when you map it into the theoretical domain, you get things like, um, a single cup of coffee, like freshly brewed coffee, would have a higher temperature than, a swimming pool filled with water. Um, but the swimming pool filled with water has more heat in it, because it's got more mass in it,
Molecular
and so
kinetic energy.
right? So, and once you've got the theoretical concepts of the difference between average and total, then you could see that you could see how that makes sense. But part of what you're doing is you're jettisoning certain parts of the old usage, or the old meanings, insofar as there were definitions. You could say we're changing the definition, and you could see this with planets. Um, right, the word planet originally just meant that shit up in the sky that's moving, as opposed to the stars that seem relatively stationary. That's what planets were, and later on, we think that, like, oh, planets are like these round bodies that are up there. They're not just like points of light, but they're these massive material things. And then later on, famously, we voted Pluto out, and we revised the definition of planet to be this pretty complicated thing where
We
you've
voted
had.
Pluto out so that we didn't have to accept so many planets in.
Yeah, that was part of it, but also we wanted to be more like a natural kind. We wanted it to be the
Sure.
sort of thing you could do induction over and all that. But part of the story is that along the way that you're revising the meaning. It wasn't the case that we had this like Lewis Ramsey set of platitudes, and that just was the meaning of planet. And then later on, we discovered
There
what
was a
planets
there was
really
a there was
were.
a process of revision that through
It's
new
a
scientific
process of revision, and that's
yeah, through
super
new
important.
scientific discovery, we had to my Hegelian is coming out here.
Yeah,
We had to synthesize the contradictions that emerged from the old ways of using to the new ways of using and kind
right.
of
And, and
smooth over all that.
And one idea that I find very useful in thinking about this, and don't worry, I will bring this back to God. But one idea that I find very useful in thinking about this question of eliminative materialism, like, do I think that you have beliefs, or are you just a brain in a meat suit? Um, is this thesis from Quine, and also Pierre Duhem, that it gets called the Duhem-Quine thesis. And in the philosophy of science, it gets discussed as the thesis that, for any theory, and
People can make assumptions.
for any seemingly disconfirming evidence, you could always revise the theory so that it isn't disconfirming evidence. One way to put it is that there is never any necessary falsification. Anything that might be interpreted as falsifying a theory or a hypothesis, you could always just reject
Change the
the
model
data.
that you're working
Yeah,
on.
you just change it. And there's really no reason why you can't. You're always free to do that. And once you take
They're
that
just suppositions.
once you take that basic idea and apply it to our beliefs in general, you realize that you're always free to pick some set of your prior beliefs and say, I'm going to hold on to these, and these other ones are the ones that I'm going to change. And so, to some degree, in deciding whether you have beliefs or not, it's not like, oh, I'm going to go collect the evidence, and the evidence is going to tell me what the right objective answer is. To some degree, it's a decision on my part. Do I want to live in a world where I interpret these other Homo sapiens as believers, as beings that have value? And I wrote this I published this paper called Metaphysical Daring as a Post-Human Survival Strategy that is mostly dealing with the kind of esoteric issue of mind uploading and whether mind uploading is possible. And after I finished writing and publishing that paper, I kept thinking about this basic thing that I was arguing for, which is when it comes to a lot of these metaphysical issues, you could just choose. You have nothing else to do but choose, like, I like this part more than I like that part. And I realized that one of the choices that you can make, just like I could choose to view you as a human being or as just a bunch of cells, I could choose to view the universe as a holy place. I could choose to view the most ultimate aspects of the universe as being divine. Um, I'm not I'm not wired in such a way that I'm going to try to recover all of classical theism. But there's a lot of theism, especially theistic traditions that get called like apophatic theology, um, that I find very congenial to this sort of view. Um, and I find it kind of, even though I can understand eliminative materialism and I could go there, I choose not to. And I kind of see this as similar to um, my view about my wife and my children. I say things and believe like my wife is the best woman in the world. Um, but I mean, if you think about that as anything like a scientific claim,
Yeah,
is she the best woman in the world?
it's a
Have you
really,
really
really low
checked?
prior probability.
Have you really like compared her to all the other women? That
Yeah,
in some sense, like I don't want to do that. I don't care.
yeah,
I don't want to like subject it to scientific scrutiny and measure the different character.
yeah.
Like I don't want to inhabit that space. Like I made vows, I fell in love with somebody, it's great, and I choose to have a view that keeps it being great. And similarly, like I think my kids are the best kids in the world. Are they really the best kids in the world? I don't. On some level, like I know that's ridiculous. There's no way they're the best kids in the world. Um, in fact, even the idea of there being the best kids in the world is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, like I want to live in that world where like they're the best kids in the world. Yes, it's ridiculous. You've got Camus hanging up behind you. I am kind of an absurdist, and I take this leap into the absurd. I know it's absurd.
You just kind of smirk back at it.
Yeah, like and when it comes to God, like, yeah, I believe in God. I believe in God. Is God like a perfect, unchanging substance? Like, is God simple? Like, I don't fucking care. I believe in God. Um, but what, like, does God know everything? I don't. I don't care. Like, if he knows everything, well, did God create the universe? Like, no, he's cooler than that. Like so part of this is dovetails with some of my interest in mysticism and meditative practices and uh there's the cloud of unknowing by pseudo Dionysus has got this via negativa conception of God, like God is just this.
Maimonides, kind of like a negative
Yeah,
theology, like we
yeah,
can
it's
say what
yeah,
God is not.
right. And part of what my interpretation of some of that, specifically the cloud of unknowing, is you go into these meditative states in which you're trying to like stop yourself from thinking. You're trying to turn off
Yeah,
these
mindfulness.
linguistic categorizations and get yourself in a place where you have this direct experience of what, like, when you come out of it and go back into the language zone and describe it, you say things like, it was as if I was God. I looked at myself and saw that like God and I were one and the same. And in some sense, like when you put it into words, it sounds ridiculous. It kind of ruins it. Um, and it's
Well, that's the
certainly not anything.
mysticism tradition, though. Is kind of like
Yeah,
there's an ineffable um, experience of it that if you were to even try to put it in words, like then you've differentiated all of the different, and like that right there ruins it. Or ruins
Right.
it's not the right phrase, but like by doing that, you lose something that's essential to it in its kind of undifferentiated thisness in the way that the
Right.
phenomenon presents
Um,
itself to you.
and
And
you
trying
know,
to talk about it is to bring your concepts to it, is to impart something from you to it, where the mysticism is going to want to say, no, you don't bring yourself to this. It comes to you.
right. And you know, the philosophical, discursive, linguistic, logical part of me is able to look at that and say, like, that's fucking bullshit. You like, what are you come on, you sound like an idiot. And then there's another version of that that says, like, you know, be careful here. There's like evil cult leaders that say the same bullshit. Like, you know, there's like real dark and dangerous territory here. Um, but you know, I've have like a really big ego and a lot of experience with really weird stuff, including psychedelic drugs, and I've survived. And so I'm like, yeah,
And
I'm
the
not.
world's absurd, so why not?
It's
Like,
absurd. I'm not an evil cult member. I'm not trying to start a cult. I'm not joining anyone else's cult. I I do, you know, I'm very heavily engaged with the Episcopal Church, but I don't, you know, literally believe the creeds. But I do believe something that is, you know, for some people, it's best described as theism. For other people, like if I was talking to an evangelical or a Christian fundamentalist, probably the best thing I could tell them is I'm an atheist. I'm an atheist, materialist, and fuck you guys. Uh, and there's other people, probably the best thing I could say is I'm a Satanist. Like Lucifer really had the right idea. So it kind of depends on my audience and where they're coming from, how I want to describe it. Um, but but I really see it as of a piece, as you know, viewing myself and my loved ones as people and not as meat machines. Even though in some sense we're just meat machines. Like I get that. I get the materialism thing. Um, I also choose not to. I choose um, to inhabit the realm of where there are beliefs and there are morals and there's God and there's a creator. And part of this is buoyed up by just a total skepticism about metaphysics. That you know, if you try to resolve these debates rationally, you realize you just wind up going in these big circles. One paper that I'd like to recommend to people is this paper by Stephen Stitch, who in a lot of ways is the father of the experimental philosophy movement. A lot of his students at Rutgers like went on to, you know, be the main movers and shakers in XFi. And he wrote this paper called Deconstructing the Mind. And he's talking about this debate about eliminative materialism, especially about the propositional attitudes and people coming from connectionism and neuroscience saying like, no, right, no, there's no such thing as propositional attitudes, and other people saying like, no, we could have a psychology version of scientific realism. We could justify the real existence of things like beliefs and desires, and he points out that you can't really make any progress on that debate, the debate about whether beliefs really exist or not, without making progress on this other debate happening in philosophy mind and philosophy of language about what reference is or what meaning is. Like, so the debate about whether beliefs exist or not can be restated as this debate about whether the word belief like latches on to some real thing out in the world. But like, what the heck is latching on? That's the problem of intentionality. And is reference real? Can we give
yeah.
a scientific account of
How can
like,
material states be about something?
yeah, exactly. And then this is and then a lot of this just comes down to these intuitions people have, like the intuitions that hold up the kind of Kripke project of, rejecting descriptionism about names. And a lot of that hinges on these intuitions that, like, well, even though this person turns out not to satisfy these descriptions, intuitively, that's what the name Gödel would refer to. If we discovered that someone, the person we've been calling Gödel didn't satisfy the description, discovered the incompleteness theorem, that was, intuitively, that would still be Gödel. And Stitch says, like, well, how do we know these intuitions are universal? Like, what if you ask people who's, that aren't native English speakers, or people that have never been to college, what their intuitions are about, what the meaning of water is? And in a lot of ways, that becomes the birth of X5. But my interest in all this is to see that, like, you can't make any progress on this one metaphysical issue unless you assume answers in this other metaphysical debate, which, pretty rapidly it just turns in a big bunch of circles. And Duhem Quine thesis comes back into my mind. Like, well, you could pick one spot and say, like, this is what I want to keep. And so if you loved qualia, and some people do, you could say, look, I've got qualia. I know what it's like to see red, and there could be zombies. I can conceive of zombies, and that's all I care about. I don't care about anything else. You could do that, and there's no argument against that if that's where you wanted to start. I start somewhere else, but one of the things that ultimately matters to me is, like, my wife and my kids, and it's meaningful, and so I choose for it to be meaningful. Now, does that mean I'm a moral realist, or I think that there's like moral facts, or that God is really objectively real? Like, in some sense, like, I reject all of that stuff. Like, I'm not saying it's objective. I'm not saying it's really real. In some sense, like, I think that is more metaphysical nonsense. Like, it's
Do you think that
real.
anti-metaphysical streak is motivated by Wittgenstein? Or do you think
Yeah. But I wouldn't describe it as like, oh, I read Wittgenstein and then boom, I'm like a Wittgensteinian.
yeah,
I
it's
feel
never
more
that
like
easy.
like, these are things I wrestle with, and I read different things along the way, and sometimes I feel like it's helping me articulate my views, and other times I feel like it's not. And so
The
as
reason I ask is so my mentor was a professor here at Old Dominion University named Dr. William Brenner, and he is a Thomist. So he's really into Aquinas, but he's also a Hume scholar and a Wittgenstein scholar. So he gives Aquinas these non-metaphysical empiricist readings. So it's actually really wild. Like, when you get down to, he sees theology like as being analogous to grammar in a way Wittgenstein would. And so the reason I ask you that question is because I can see the attraction to, he spent years with me kind of working through Wittgenstein, and that's one of the threads that I've kind of I'm not saying I'm anti metaphysical thinking or anything like that, but I do see the attraction of kind of dissolving a lot of these metaphysical problems and metaphysical worries as just confusions in language. And then it just, at the end of the day, we end up talking past each other. And then a lot of these metaphysical differences will just always be irresolvable because we'll just never really be able to, the language becomes incommensurable.
So, like with a lot of these historical figures, you could say, like, oh, I'm a Wittgensteinian or I'm a Humean. And then you talk to some other so-called Humean or Wittgensteinian, and it turns out, like, you don't agree about what Wittgenstein said or what Hume said. So to some degree, like, I'm really reluctant to identify with anybody. I don't have any heroes. But nonetheless, like, I have interpretations of Wittgenstein, whereby I think I agree with a lot of Wittgenstein. Ditto for Hume, ditto for Descartes. And one
I say the
thing
same thing about Hegel, and they can't all. There's no way that all those can fit together.
I hear people talk about Hegel, and it sounds totally reasonable to me, and that makes me very suspicious, because when I try to read Hegel, I'm like,
It's because it's all absurd.
what? But anyway, so there's one version of like Hume and Wittgenstein that I really don't like, and I'm not blaming them for it, but it's an interpretation of them whereby they're on some kind of like mental hygiene or purity campaign, whereby like
Yeah.
there are these confusions, and we got to get rid of these confusions and just stick with so this is kind of like positivism, right? Like we're not going to say the nothing nuts. We're just gonna be super pure and just state things in terms of sense data. I think, and this is kind of Quinian, I don't think you could ever have that kind of purity, that everything is always just this big giant mess and ball of confusion.
Ironically, I think that's the lesson of Hume, is that it's just always a big mess. And then the more you try to clean the mess up, the more mess you make.
So there's a way of reading Hume, like for example on causation, right, where he's not saying there's no such thing as causation, nor is he saying here's the right definition of causation. He's just saying, like, look, this is the best we could do, and you could go this way or you could go that way, and that's kind of the situation that we're in. Is there really causation? You could pick one of these things and call it causation if you want, but you're not gonna it's gonna be a decision on your part. The version of Wittgenstein that I don't like is that there's some kind of grammar we could discover. There's some kind of like rules for the right way of talking.
Yeah.
So for example, PMS Hacker has got this criticism of naturalism and especially brain influenced philosophy of mind, where he accuses all these people in neuroscience and philosophy of mind as committing the mereological fallacy, that if we really look at the grammar of words, we'll realize that you should never attribute to parts of people, like their brain, states or processes that grammatically belong to the whole person. And I think that
I'm not a fan of that reading of
that kind of language police prescriptivism is bullshit. Like you're not the boss of us.
Wittgenstein, was his whole project was very much antithetical to that.
Yeah, I mean, right. There's like
an irony that's an interpretation of him.
Yeah, and I feel like it's useful to be worried about that sort of thing. But I don't think there's a right answer. I mean, if you wanted to say your brain has beliefs or your brain is thinking, like, go knock yourself out. Like if you wanted to say that your stomach is digesting food,
yeah,
go ahead. Like
just pull a G Moore and be like, these are my hands. Here's one hand.
I mean, there's going to be certain points where we want more detail, or we want to like, so. Is it really true that everything that you might want to call digestion happens exclusively in the stomach? Well, I mean, what is digestion? Isn't it like breaking nutrients down in a way that's absorbable by the body? Is that what you mean by digestion? If you do, then some digestion happens in your mouth while you're like mixing the food with saliva. And arguably some digestion happens in the cooking pot when you're heating it up. And part of what's great about Homo sapiens is we figured out how to extend digestion into the external world. If you wanted to use the words that way, you could, and no one's stopping you. So I don't think that there's a right way of speaking. And one way of putting this is in terms of like the Quinean problem of translation. We've got this one way of using pieces of English, and this other way of using some other pieces of English, and you could ask the question, what is the right way to translate this one chunk of English into this other chunk of English? And the answer is there is no one right way to do it. There's a whole bunch of ways of doing it. And some of them might be better for some purposes than others. And some of them might just be a tie. And ultimately, that's all there is like decisions that we make. Like, do we want to, for now on, say that rusting is the same thing as combusting? Do we want to say that? Do we want to say that there's no difference between burning a burning piece of wood and a rusting piece of metal? Or do we want to distinguish those ways of speaking? There's no right answer. You're not like science doesn't come in and tell us the right way to use English words.
Because science is going to have its own language game.
And there is no such thing as the right way to use English words. Like there's just, you know, God doesn't care about, right? There's no 10 commandments for how to use English. And what language would it be written in anyway?
Yeah.
The right language.
Divine commands are the universal grammar.
So about like Hume and Wittgenstein, like in some ways I'm pro metaphysics. But I think of metaphysics as more like this creative thing. Like you can choose, and just like you could choose how to dress. Do you want to be goth? Right? Is there a right way to dress? Is there a right music to listen to? So I decorate my life with certain kinds of clothes and certain kind of music, and I let my kids make all this art, and I love it. Similarly, like metaphysics and theology, I'm very comfortable with the idea that we can pick and we can choose, and it isn't. I'm not saying that therefore subjective idealism. Like therefore it's just in our mind, man. That's not what I'm saying. It's weirder and more complicated than that. Sure, there's a bunch of objective reality, but objective reality doesn't tell us how to use the word planet. Like it's not. You're not going to find the word planet carved on on the bottom of the planet, right? It's up to, we make these decisions about what noises we want to make. Like what else would there be? Like, so we rapidly are going to get, into issues about like what is truth and what is reference. And ultimately I kind of go in like kind of a deflationary, semi-realist, set of views, but I really am disinclined to say like what's really going on here is it's just the mind, or what's really going on here is it's just experience. What's really going on here is just what's verifiable, or what's really going on here is what's grammatically licensed. No, there is no what's really going on. So does that mean there's nothing? No, it's not that either. So like in some sense, I reject all of the metaphysical views and accept all of them, which is very mystical. It's very mystical.
Very dialectical. It's very Hegelian. I love it.
I guess it's whatever.
It's the movement
Am I Hegelian?
It's neither of them, but we keep something of it. Like it's not this, and it's not that, but it's a little bit of both of them. So that's kind of how I see it in my own view, that we have these religious forms of life and we have these non-religious forms of life, and that they can combine in very interesting ways. And so some of the ways in which they combine are what we get are the theistic things that we get, the ideas of a perfect person that we worship, and then we have certain rituals, and he could be angry or mad based on how we act. Like these are just the ways in which our religious forms of life and our non-religious forms of life kind of, the Hegelian term is sublate. You take up all the good things about the religious traditions, and you take up all the things about the non-religious traditions, and you get kind of this Spinoza type view where you've got two sides of one coin, and neither of these sides are reducible to the other, but neither side is dispensable. You have to have them
Yeah.
both.
Yeah. I mean, part of it, there's a lot of different pieces feeding into this. One of them is the earlier stuff we were talking about, which is just a kind of general skepticism about metaphysics. Well, simultaneously enjoy, like, I love metaphysics, but it's kind of like the way I love comic books. You know, uh, it's something I like to immerse myself in, um, and that's not to say I think it's false or I'm an error theorist about it. That would be too metaphysical of a stance, about my love of metaphysics. But another thing is feeding into this is just kind of like directly thinking about some of these theological positions. A lot of people, they think the way they think about God, classical, omni God or Christian God, is that if that stuff is objectively true, then what they're going to get for free is certain stuff about the meaning of their life, a sense of purpose and morality. And my view is that no, those things are completely detachable. Like it could turn out that the omni God does exist and it fucking sucks. Like, that's just the worst news in the world.
Yeah.
That
You're going to be bored infinitely.
Yeah, or worse. So one thing that's been very influential on me is this movie from a few decades ago called The Rapture, starring Mimi Rogers and David Duchovny. Way before X-Files, David Duchovny was in this movie. And I highly recommend it, but I'm going to spoil the hell out of it right now because it's been around for a while. I feel like this no spoilers
Yeah.
moratorium has been
After a
lifted.
couple decades, though,
After a few decades, if you haven't seen Star Wars yet, like, sorry. Darth Vader's Luke's father. So anyway, like, the movie starts
my
off.
Star Wars shirt too.
I love Star Wars. You got Camus, you got Star Wars.
Did we
So the
just
movie
become
starts.
best friends?
Yeah, we. So anyway, this movie, The Rapture, I highly recommend it. And it's this very, like, religious kind of movie, as the title might lead you to believe. And it starts off with these two, like, completely decadent individuals. They're swingers and they go to all these sex parties. But then, like, they start running in all these different people who are reporting a dream that they've all had. All these people all around the world start having the same dream. And in the dream, there's like a pearl. Everyone sees this, like, big pearl, and there's like some child that is implicated. And rapidly, it's like this person rises up, who is like the leader of this new religious movement, which is this kind of Christian movement. And so the main character, the Mimi Rogers character, she joins the religion, and she gives up her, like, swinging hedonistic lifestyle and becomes, like, very, fundamentalist. And she ends up getting pregnant, and has a daughter. And now, fast forward, this religion is saying, like, the end is coming. The book of Revelations is going to be coming true real soon. And if you've been having the dream, you're among the chosen. There's going to be some crazy shit going down, but you're going to go to heaven. It's going to be cool. And she decides that, like, she doesn't want to stick around for the apocalypse. So she goes up into the woods with a gun and her daughter, and the plan is to murder suicide so that they could just go straight to heaven and not have to deal with the apocalypse, which, there's going to be rivers of blood and the four horsemen and all that. So she shoots her daughter, and then when it's time for her to turn the gun on herself, she, like, can't bring herself to do it. And then some forest ranger shows up, and then she gets arrested. And so fast forward, then she's in jail. So she's been convicted for murdering her daughter. She's in jail. she's really lost hope. Like believing in this religion has led her to kill her daughter, and now she's in jail. Like, it's just horrible. And then she hears this sound, and it's the trumpets of the apocalypse. Gabriel is blowing his horn, and the bars of the prison just fall away. And this is depicted in such a way that the viewer is like basically being told, look, this is happening. This is not a hallucination. It's happening. It's the book of Revelations is coming true. And the very last scene in the movie, she is now in this like darkened landscape. And you can tell she's like being confronted with God. Like she's talking to God. You don't hear what God is saying to her. It's kind of like in a movie when someone's talking on the phone and you piece together what the other person is saying. So she's having a conversation with God, and you can tell that God is basically saying, like, sorry about all that. It kind of sucked, but like, come on into heaven. Here we are. You made it, baby. And she says to him, fuck you. Like, you let me kill my daughter. Fuck you. And she turns her back on God and walks away into the void, into the abyss. Roll credits, end of movie. And I thought, like, yeah, right. Like, even if it somehow can be proven to you that God exists, like, that doesn't solve anything. Why should I do what he says?
You still have this question of whether or not this object is worthy of our worship. It might not be worthy of our worship.
Maybe he's a dick. Like, right? Maybe, even though he's the most powerful being, and maybe you should line up with Lucifer and the rebel angels, like, right? Or maybe you should just reject the whole thing and say, like, fuck it, like, and there's like if you read a lot of fantasy and science fiction, you read these different like scenarios and thought experiments and stories about like, yeah, these people that like they choose hell because like just the whole thing is just so horrible, and they're so, they reject it. You're free to reject it. And the moral of the story for me is just like with Pluto, there's no objective right answer, nor is there any objective right answer about what you should do, even if it can be proven to you that God exists in this classical sense, or even if it could be proven to you that Jesus, the Nazarene was resurrected and went and harrowed hell so that we can be saved. Like, you could just still say, like, that's bonkers. I mean, like, you guys are crazy. Like, your dad is punishing you because of sins that we committed. Like, no way. I'm still going to be a Buddhist, even though if you guys are real, I still choose Buddhism or whatever. So like that kind of stuff has always like had a big influence on me, leading me to this kind of view that I'm not really going to get satisfaction from pursuing the the kind of reasoning you see in apologetics, where people are trying to prove, like, does God really exist or not? In some sense, like, that wouldn't settle anything that's important. The really important stuff is ultimately, it's a choice. It's up to you. Like, is Sisyphus happy? Right?
We have to imagine him happy.
We have to imagine him happy. But is he really happy? Well, there's some sense in which there's maybe he is. You could choose to imagine him happy, and you are Sisyphus, and maybe you could be happy and still be pushing the boulder up the hill. And it could suck, and maybe that's what's great about it, is that there's like, life is this horrible tragedy, and we're all doomed to die in these horrible ways. We're all fucked, and that's beautiful.
This has been a wonderful conversation. We're coming up on the 2-hour mark.
Holy moly. It feels like 40 minutes has gone by. So that's a good sign.
Before we get to that 2-hour mark, I do want to give you a chance to tell the audience where people can find your work if they're interested in finding out more about you or the topics that you've written on.
So The one-stop shop for all things Pete Mandik is my website, petemandik.net. So from there, you can find like most of my published academic articles I've made available, and you can get to them from my website to my Phil Papers page is where I put them in some cases, violating copyright so that I could spread the word. And from there, you could also find out information about books that I've published and forthcoming book projects. You can see some of my comics and find out how to find even more of them. Links to my social media. I've got a podcast of my own and a YouTube channel and all that you could find at petemandik.net.
Thank you so much for coming on today. It was very honestly a pleasure to be able to talk to you today. And
I had a blast. That's all my favorite stuff.
I really hope that we'll be able to have you on sometime in the future to discuss maybe a similar topic, same topic.
Sure.
Who knows?
I would love to come back. I feel like we just scratched the surface on some of this.
That's how it always feels in philosophy, is you feel like it's just, you've barely even gotten a few feet before you realize, like, hey, it's time to stop, and we'll have to continue this journey some other time.